Hi everyone, hope you're enjoying the talk so far at Source ZeroCon. My name is Amber Hamlet and today I'll be presenting Get Off My Wireless LAN, Hacking Wireless Networks. A quick overview of what I'll be discussing in this talk includes a brief introduction of Wi-Fi terminology and specifications. From there, we'll look at a timeline of Wi-Fi security and cryptography, and then get into demos and wireless network attacks, and end with takeaways and recommendations. And as a quick disclaimer, this presentation and tutorial shown are for educational purposes only. We'll begin by discussing some Wi-Fi terminology. The Wi-Fi specifications were derived from the IEEE standard 802.1x or 802.11. And as you can see, there are several standards listed below. The biggest difference between these standards is the frequency in which they operate on. 802.11a and AC both operate on the 5 gigahertz bands. 802.11b and G operate on the 2.4 gigahertz bands, and 802.11n operates on both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz bands. The main difference between 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz networks are the correlating network speeds and wireless ranges or coverage of your network. With a 2.4 gigahertz network, the wireless coverage or range of your network is much farther than a 5 gigahertz network. However, the speeds are going to be much slower. And likewise, with a 5 gigahertz network, the network speeds are faster, but the network range and coverage is going to be much smaller. The 2.4 gigahertz band consists of 11 different channels, 8 of which overlap. Channels 1, 6, and 11 are commonly used because these channels do not overlap and therefore there's less interference on these channels. The 5 gigahertz band consists of 45 channels with a lot less overlap. 24 out of the 45 channels do not overlap. Some other terms we should be familiar with are the Extended Service Set Identifier or ESSID. This is also referred to as the network name. So if we look at the image in the center, we have our wireless access point with the ESSID or network name of Acme Corp guest. Underneath that, we see the basic service set identifier for the access point. The BSSID is also known as the MAC address or the hardware address. And finally, beneath the BSSID, we see the encryption type used on this network, which is WPA2-PSK. We'll cover WPA2 in later slides. However, PSK stands for Preshared Key. This is also known as the Wi-Fi passphrase or password used to authenticate to the network. And to the right of the image, we see 3 devices or clients connected to this access point, along with their corresponding BSSIDs or MAC addresses as well. So as wireless networks have evolved, the Wi-Fi Alliance has developed several security protocols to help improve wireless network security. And in 1999, WEP, or Wired Equivalent Privacy, was released, which uses the RC4 cipher and is vulnerable to analytical attacks due to the initialization vector being sent in the clear. Hopefully, we're not seeing too many networks still being configured with this today, as it reached its end of life in 2004 when WPA2 was released. In 2003, WPA or Wi-Fi Protected Access was released, which still used overall weak security and used RC4 with temporal key integrity protocol. WPA supports the use of a pre-shared key or password, along with 802.1x support and EAP variants for authentication. This is often referred to as WPA Enterprise. The migration from WEP to WPA was pretty seamless and only required a firmware upgrade, whereas upgrading from WPA to WPA2 or WPA3 is going to require hardware upgrades in addition to those firmware upgrades. In 2004, this is when WPA2 was released, and this is a stronger version than WPA and uses AES encryption instead of RC4 with TKIP. And it still supports the use of a pre-shared key along with the enterprise authentication configuration as well. And in 2018, the third iteration of WPA was released, and this uses AES 128 and 196-bit encryption keys for the personal and enterprise configurations, respectively. And for the pre-shared key encryption, This uses the simultaneous authentication of equals, which is a more secure way of password authentication. And so for us as an attacker, this means the recovery of that pre-shared key through our brute force attacks, which we'll cover here shortly, is going to be much more difficult with a WPA3 configured network. However, we still have support with the 802.1x support and EAP variants for the enterprise configuration as well. So now that we have a basic understanding of some Wi-Fi terms, let's get into the Wi-Fi hacking methodology. So we'll first start by discovering wireless networks and their configurations, similar to the previous slides. From there, we can perform traffic analysis and actually start targeting our network. And then once we have that initial information, we can start performing our attacks on our specific network. And there are a few different kinds of wireless network attacks that we can perform depending on the way the network was configured. And so with a pre-shared key configuration, we can capture the four-way handshake and potentially recover the pre-shared key or password of that network. We can also perform a deauthentication attack to help speed up this process of capturing the four-way handshake if we can't capture it in other ways. And there's also evil twin attacks and rogue access points that can be used to attack enterprise networks or networks with more advanced configurations where a fake access point is created to assist in a man-in-the-middle attack. Some tools that we'll need to perform these wireless attacks include a wireless network card that supports monitor mode and packet injection. I have two examples here with the Hack5 Pineapple on the left and the Alpha card on the right that supports both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz frequency ranges. Also need a Linux operating system of choice. I'm performing my demos in Kali Linux. And we're going to be using the Aircrack NG suite, which comes built into the Kali OS. And this suite of tools is going to be used for network discovery as long with some of our attacks. And then we're also going to be using EAP Hammer from GitHub for our evil twin attack and creation of our fake certificate for our enterprise network. So before we get into the demo of the pre-shared key attack, here's a picture of what that four-way handshake looks like. And so the important thing to know is that the master key is derived from the pre-shared key or password entered to connect to the network. And from there, the device and the access point perform a four-way handshake for authentication. An attacker can eavesdrop on this four-way handshake to capture it and then perform a brute force attack and potentially recover the pre-shared key if an attacker has enough time or the password is weak enough. So our target network for this attack is Acme Corp Guest, which is configured with the pre-shared key. The output shown in the screenshot is for me putting my Alpha card into monitor mode and then using AeroDump NG to find what wireless networks are around me. And I did this network discovery before the demos to minimize the other networks shown, mainly not to broadcast my personal networks along with my neighbor's Wi-Fi as well. I also want to point out the first three networks shown with the network name or ESSID of linked :0. Whenever you see this output when discovering networks, this means that the network is hidden or that the access point isn't broadcasting the network name. However, this is essentially security through obscurity. There are numerous ways that you can recover the hidden network name very easily. However, for our demo, we have the target network of Acme Corp Guest. And so from left to right, we can see the BSSID listed there. It's operating on channel 6, and it's using WPA2 for the encryption type, and as we know, a pre-shared key. So I have a screenshot up there as well. Since we're not doing the discovery, we will need this information for the pre-shared key attack. So I'm first going to run iwconfig to see that Kali has detected my Alpha wireless card. iwconfig is similar to ifconfig, however, it returns information for wireless devices. So we first need to put our device into monitor mode using airmon-ng. So we can do this by using airmon-ng start with our interface name, and we should see our device being put into monitor mode. We can confirm this by rerunning iwconfig and see that the mode has changed. And so this is where you would normally run AeroDump with your interface name to determine the networks around you. However, this was done previously. So instead we can use AeroDump NG to target Acme Corp Guest specifically an attempt to capture the WPA four-way handshake. So I'm going to do that now and specify the channel along with the BSS ID of the access point, and then a file to save the WPA handshake out to, and then specify our interface to perform this attack on. So once I hit launch, we are now waiting for a device to connect to the network and potentially capture the WPA handshake. And so we can see that there is one client associated with this network already. In the real world, there's probably going to be multiple clients associated with an access point. But for this demo, I only had my laptop connected. So this is where we sit and wait for somebody to connect to the network and potentially gather enough data for that WPA handshake. However, if you don't have enough time or want to speed this up, we can perform a deauthentication attack. And this is where we're going to kick a user off the network momentarily in the hopes that they reconnect so we can capture that WPA handshake. So I'm going to do that in the second terminal now and use a tool called Air Replay NG. So I'm going to specify the deauth attack and run this attack 10 times. We want to keep this number pretty small as we're going to be sending deauthentication packets and essentially kicking off the user momentarily. So if we do this continuously, this will essentially be a denial of service. So we'll need the BSS ID of the access point along with the MAC address of the user that we want to kick off the network momentarily, and then specify the interface name to perform this attack on. So you can see once I launch this, the packets under the lost column in arrow dump start to increase by quite a bit. However, we did not capture the WPA handshake for this network. So I'm going to launch this attack one more time. And so you can see at the top there, we have now obtained the WPA handshake for the Acme Corp guest network when this user momentarily deauthenticated and then reauthenticated to the network. So if we ls here, we can see arrow dump has outputted several files for us. So we can use the captured file and aircrack ng to try to recover the pre-shared key password of this network. So we're going to specify the BSS ID of the access point along with the word list that we want to use for our brute force attack. And then finally, our captured file with our WPA handshake. So depending on how strong the password is, this can take some time to recover. Our password was very poor, so we got it back in a matter of seconds. And this is indeed the Wi-Fi password for Acme Corp guest. And you can see the information there from the four-way handshake. Aircrack NG has actually shown you the master key and all of these other methods that are used during this handshake. But we can take this password now and authenticate to the Acme Corp guest network. So we had talked previously about WPA Enterprise and the support for EAP variants. WPA Enterprise was another enhancement in wireless configuration for WPA networks. EAP, or Extensible Authentication Protocol, is an authentication framework that provides common functions and negotiation of authentication methods called EAP methods. There are currently about 40 different EAP methods defined. However, we're only going to cover 3 of those, which are protected EAP, EAP TTLS, and EAP TLS. WPA Enterprise uses a radius server for user authentication where these EAP methods are configured. Protected EAP and EAP TTLS are the most common EAP methods used in wireless enterprise network configurations. Both of these methods are proprietary and tunneled, meaning that the information sent between the client and the radius server is protected with a TLS tunnel, and another inter-authentication method is used for sending credentials. Both of these methods are pretty similar, though, in that they both only enforce certificates on the server side and the client side is optional. And we'll see why these two methods and configurations have vulnerabilities associated with them in a few slides. EAP TLS is not proprietary and not tunneled. This method enforces certificates on both the client and server side, making the deployment difficulties a little bit more challenging than the other two methods. Not only is this deployment a heavy task, but maintenance is pretty costly as well. However, this configuration will offer the strongest security for an enterprise network. Some of the common EAP inner authentication methods you may see include Microsoft's Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol version 2. This protocol uses weak DES encryption, which is vulnerable to brute force attacks. So we can potentially recover the net NTLM v1 password hash of users who authenticate to networks with this configuration. And as the name suggests, with this being a Microsoft protocol, this EAP method is mostly used when Windows OSs authenticate to wireless networks. EAP Generic Token Card, or GTC, was created by Cisco as an alternative to MS-CHAP v2, and this exchanges authentication credentials over the network in clear text. So we can potentially recover clear text usernames and passwords. Generic token card is mainly used with smart devices like your phone and tablet, as these devices don't support the more advanced challenge handshake type protocols. So how do these attacks happen in real life? As we discussed previously, PEEP and EAP TTLS both do not enforce certificates on the client side, meaning both of these methods are vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack. So an attacker can create a fake certificate and spoof the real access point, and this is very difficult to detect on the user or client side. And due to your Wi-Fi speed and connection, depending on how close you are to the access point to the network, your wireless device will connect the access point with the strongest signal. And if your device recognizes that you've connected to the same network previously, it marks this network as known or trusted. So looking at the diagram, we have a coffee shop with the ESSID of free Wi-Fi, and we have an attacker and a victim sitting outside. The attacker created a fake access point spoofing the coffee shop's Wi-Fi with the same ESSID name. And since the attacker's access point is closer, the victim device will connect to the attacker's access point instead of the coffee shop's access point. And so this is where the man-in-the-middle attack occurs. So for our evil twin attack, we are going to have a WPA2 enterprise network of Acme Corp. And we're going to use EAP Hammer to create a fake access point spoofing the real Acme Corp network. I'd highly recommend reading the wiki of this tool, as there are numerous attacks that this tool supports, including captive portals and many more. We're going to scratch the surface of this tool today by using it to create a fake certificate for our access point and also use it to stand up our access point. And looking at the screenshot below, I went ahead and did our network discovery ahead of time. And so we can see from the screenshot here, the BSSID looks a little weird because I configured this network on the Hack5 Pineapple. And didn't change the default MAC address. However, the MAC address should generally match the vendor or manufacturer of the access point. We can see that this network is broadcasting on channel 11 and is an enterprise network from the WPA2 and MGT configuration. So I'm first going to start with IWconfig again and see that Kali still has my alpha card and managed mode. And on my Windows device, browse the networks around me and see that Acme Corp is available. So we're first going to use EAP Hammer to create a certificate for our fake access point. And we can do that with the cert wizard. So once we run this, it's going to ask us a series of questions for the certificate creation. And we want this information to be as real as possible. We can even copy the legitimate certificate from the real access point, or at least make it as close to the target information as possible. So when it's asking for the organization for the certs, I'm specifying Acme Corp and giving it a fake email, itsecurity@acmecorp.com. And we'll see why we want this information to look more realistic in a second. So once our certificate is created, we can use EAP Hammer to stand up our fake access point. So we'll specify our interface name, what our target evil access point network is going to be. So we're going to spoof Acme Corp. We want to match the same channel, so we're going to broadcast on channel 11 as well, and specify the auth type of WPA-EAP. We're using WPA version 2, and TAC creds for credential theft. So once we run this, EAP Hammer is going to create an access point with the same name of Acme Corp. And we can see that with the AP enabled there. And just as an OPSEC note, I didn't specify the BSSID of our access point, so that's why it gave us the default version seen there. So now I'm going to browse networks near me again on my Windows device and connect to what I think is the Acme Corp network seen previously. So we can see we're actually authenticating to my evil twin access point, and we can see that traffic in EAP Hammer. And I've seen some issues testing this out in my lab with users that input information automatically. You may not get the credentials. However, with users knowing how finicky Wi-Fi is, they're most likely going to reconnect again. So I'm going to do that again and enter my credentials manually. So once we hit OK, we can see we get a different prompt asking if we expect this network to be here. If so, hit OK. If the user gets more information, they can actually see the certificate information that we provided with EAP Hammer. So this is why we want this to match our target information. So from a user perspective, that's all they get as a hint about this network. And they say, it looks like my normal network I connect to, and I hit OK. And we can see from EAP Hammer, we see the MSCHAP v2 authentication come across, and we have the net NTLM hash of the user LNOPE. So we can take the John the Ripper format or hashcat format of this hash and try to recover this password in an offline dictionary brute force attack. And we had spoken previously about generic token card as another EAP method. And so you can't see this occurring on the screen, but I'm authenticating to the network with my mobile device. And you can see now we have the generic token card authentication come across. And as we expect, we have the clear text username and password for B. Wyatt. And I have one more authentication attempt coming through as a proof of concept. So we have one more clear text password come through. And so you can see how this is a big problem, as an attacker can set up an evil access point and leave it running for several hours and just wait for users to accidentally connect to a network that they think is one that they've connected to before, or one that looks legit, and it's actually an attacker's network. And so if post-exploitation is in scope, we can take these credentials now and try to leverage and see if we can get further into the network or potentially recover sensitive information. We now have clear text credentials that we could use to try to log into things like Office 365 or other external applications to see what information we can find. With the Windows user credentials, most likely this is going to be tied to Active Directory. So if we're able to recover LNOPE's credential, we could have a authenticated domain user for this network. And so we could use this account to move laterally in the network, or again, for further post-exploitation activities. So understanding the insecurity of these configurations with WPA, WPA2 personal and the use of a preshared key, this configuration is vulnerable to brute force dictionary attacks if an attacker can capture that four-way handshake and the password is weak enough. There's also the risk that you're using a shared password for authentication, so the likelihood of several people having this password is very high. With WPA, WPA2 Enterprise and the use of radius servers and EAP methods, if certificates aren't enforced on both the client and the server, these certificates can be spoofed and be vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack, which allows an attacker to intercept credentials via a fake access point, like we just seen. And so some takeaways, if you need to use a WPA or WPA2 personal in use of a pre-shared key, ensure that the password is at least 12 plus characters and isn't easily guessable. It's also recommended to rotate the password regularly and at minimum when employees leave the organization. You can also upgrade to WPA3, which reduces the chances of a successful brute force attack. However, man-in-the-middle attacks are still possible with rogue access points or evil twin attacks. And with WPA WPA2 Enterprise, ideally you want to use EAP TLS as it enforces certificates on both the client and server side and is not vulnerable to these man-in-the-middle attacks. However, if EAP TLS isn't an option due to overhead and deployment difficulties, you can also add support for wireless intrusion prevention systems to help detect rogue access points on the network. It's also recommended to disable these auto-connect and auto-join features on client devices to help minimize credential theft when devices are trying to connect to known networks that look like they're trusted. Here are some of the references and sources that were used throughout my talk, along with some of the images. Thank you all so much for attending my presentation. If anyone has any questions, you can find me on Discord and Twitter at Secure Things. See you guys there.